Last week, I traveled with Pastor Daniel Brown to Ethiopia for a short trip. We were on the ground 3.5 days, and the purpose of the trip was to explore a new partnership. Now, I don't mean by that the euphemistic partnership of we give money to missionaries. I could do that here when they're in town, but rather an authentic we give and we receive partnership with an organization who's facilitating a hopeful linkage between our local church community and a local church community in or around Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, that's serving children on the margins of their society in a very similar way to our initiative in Lincoln Park. But we bring resources and the gospel and hope to stand alongside this local church that's wrapping around their community with Jesus' love. So we're looking for essentially an analog partner community to our Lincoln Park partner community in Africa. And so we found a lot of promising projects, and by that I don't mean government housing, I mean initiatives of this ministry, One Child Matters, which facilitates care and growth in the lives of children in various developing world countries and the local church in that area. We looked at 4 different projects and really felt the sense of God's leading in the weeks that follow. Pastor Darius and I and Pastor Daniel will meet with the leadership of that organization. We'll correspond with the country leadership in Ethiopia. We'll measure twice and cut once because we don't want to make a promise that we're not prepared to keep. And in the coming months, I anticipate that we'll have a lot to share with you about a new partner community and opportunities that will afford for all of us to model Jesus' love and to care for people in particular ways. Being that I was in Ethiopia, I had, as well as the business of the trip, that opportunity that virtually any travel to any developing world area affords one to calibrate my perspective. Do you know what I mean? You come back from a trip like that realizing things that you tacitly know, but they come to the forefront and they put other things in proper perspective. And probably chief among those this time for me was the reminder that, as they say, you and I, by virtue of having been born in the global modern West, and that doesn't apply to every one of us, but I think by virtue of the fact that we're here, we can all be grafted into that circle for the purposes of the analysis, that you and I have won the global lottery. It's as if we won the Mega Millions Powerball when it was 250 million or something like that, by virtue of being born here now. Here versus where most of the rest of the world lives and the conditions in which they live. Now versus 500 years ago, when even the Anglo-Saxon races that are considered demographically and sociologically to be the most privileged financially were farming their few acres with pitchforks, defending their families from hordes of marauding Vikings and the bubonic plague to boot. We have it better than the rest of the world and the rest of the history of the world, and we know it, but traveling as I did last week reminds one of it. And so I get to remind you of it as well. Our title this morning, What Life is All About. We're in John chapter 11, continuing in our study through Jesus' most gritty and granular, homegrown and behind-the-scenes gospel. The Bible tells us a man named Lazarus was sick. He lived in Bethany with his sisters Mary and Martha. And this is the Mary who later poured the expensive perfume in the Lord's feet and wiped them with her hair. And I would add, by way of textual commentary, that this is the Martha who said, Jesus, tell my sister to help me do the work. But Jesus said, she's sitting at my feet. She's got the bigger picture figured out. She's chosen the better part. Same Mary and Martha. Her brother Lazarus was sick, and so the 2 sisters sent a message. Clean up on aisle 4? Isn't that what you're supposed to say? I was waiting for someone else to say it, but it was me. So the 2 sisters sent a message to Jesus telling him, it was right on cue too. So the 2 sisters sent a message to Jesus telling him, clean up on aisle 4. Telling him, Lord, your dear friend is very sick. So when Jesus heard about it, he didn't say, Lazarus isn't my dear friend. I think I met him once at a conference. He acknowledged this dude was his buddy, right? But he told his disciples Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. No, it happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will receive glory from this. So although Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, he stayed where he was for the next 2 days. Finally, he said to his disciples, let's go back to Judea. All right, quickly, by way of contextual summary, if this passage sounds familiar, it's because we took a leap ahead in our John study and looked at this passage for Easter. And if church experts say that 2/3 of a congregation is in service on any given Sunday, well, probably 3/3 are in service on Easter Sunday. So unless you were like worshiping at your mom's church for Easter, most of us will remember that. I am the resurrection and the life. We looked at Jesus' teaching here in John 11 to illuminate the significance of his own resurrection, which is, of course, what you talk about on Easter. But we're going to revisit this passage now, but look at it from another angle, okay? So that's what we're at today. The bottom line here is that Jesus appears to have let his friend die so that he could bring him back to life, which causes you to kind of look at Jesus from an angled glare, because that doesn't seem consistent with his character. Being in very nature God, love being the purpose of his life, it seems a little cold. You know, it's not as though he didn't acknowledge Lazarus being his buddy or Mary and Martha being special to him. He stayed with them in his last week. He'd go out and spend the nights in the suburb of Bethany with them, and then he'd go in to the city during the day. So these were his peeps, right? And rightfully, they'd think, well, gosh, we've watched him heal lepers and nameless, faceless masses. Why not Lazarus? But Jesus appears to have let Lazarus die on purpose. It wasn't like, you know, he was in the middle of an event, he couldn't get out of it, I'll be there as soon as I can. No, he said, we're going to remain a little longer. And that's a little bit of a thing to work through. And we get this only in John, because remember, John's purpose isn't like Matthew, Mark, and Luke, an orderly synoptic account. John's purpose is to give us like the backstage pass. We get the sort of tell-all memoir that if I'm Jesus, I'd be like, you know, that part I'm editing out. That wasn't really for public consumption. I was telling you guys this. They're going to misunderstand this for the next 2,000 years. So you got to take it in the context of the whole of Jesus' life and ministry. But John gives us this glimpse that Jesus is like, dudes, we're actually not going. They're like, huh? No, we're not going. You want to let Lazarus die? Yes, precisely. That's what we're doing. Verse 11, it continues, Jesus said, our friend Lazarus now has fallen asleep. This is a couple days later. But now I'll go and wake him up. And the disciples said, Lord, if he's sleeping, he will soon get better. Duh, disciples moment. They thought Jesus meant sleeping. He actually meant dead. So he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. Not mostly dead, but all dead. There's a difference, you know. So, if he's all dead, there's only one thing you can do, which is go through his pockets and look for loose change. Come on, don't you guys watch movies? And for your sake, I'm glad I wasn't there. For now, you will really believe. So come on, let's go see him. They're like, you want to go see his corpse? All right. And so let me offer a very unscientific, simple observation to frame this passage. And that is that Jesus seems to look at death quite differently than we do. In verse 21, he gets there, and Martha says, Jesus, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus told her, your brother will rise again. And she says, yes, he will rise when everyone else rises at the last day. But we're not talking about the last day. We're talking about this day, this particular day of Jesus couldn't be bothered to come and heal my brother fame. So she's a little snarky. You can kind of read it in the tone. And Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. Everyone who lives and believes in me will never, ever die. Do you believe this, Martha? And she's like, yes, Lord. I've always believed that you're Messiah, that you're the Son of God, the one who's coming into the world. It's not really the point, though. You can kind of hear her going, Jesus, this is not the time for one of your quizzical theological rabbit trails. My brother just died. Thanks a lot. I kind of don't blame her, you know. I think I'd be thinking that if I'm honest. I mean, not if I had 2,000 years of reading about Jesus' life in perspective, but I think if I'm in real time, I would have been all Martha myself. Last week, in last week's text anyway, Jesus said, I came that they would have life and have it to the full, have it abundantly. Just what did Jesus mean by have it to the full? I think this week's towering I am statement in this sequence of such statements in the middle part of the Gospel of John, Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. He qualifies just what life is all about. Because I think we hear, I came that you would have life and have it abundantly, and we're like, ha, finally, a promise that's kind of speaking to me. Like all this losing my life and, hard to be rich and go to heaven. I'm kind of that guy, Jesus. You're not leaving a lot of meat on the bones for me, but this gets me where I am. Because abundance, that's my thing. Like I got abundance, I know it, that's my world. We all live in abundance, right? You won the global lottery. So, hey, Jesus came that we could have life abundantly. There's a thing for me here. So that's good because I'm in the abundance business. And even though things have worked out well, I started my company, it prospered, I got investors, I was able to give them shares. Look, I own my cars outright, I bought my house, but there's so much more to go because it has to go public. And then I got to diversify it. Okay, Lord, here's my abundance checklist. And we bring this verse like a beast to him in prayer, thinking he meant that we should call on him to have come that we would have wealth and have it in abundance. Ever noticed how we do that? We kind of translate subconsciously on the fly. We do it all the time. It's a thing that humans do. And we'll take a verse like this that says one thing and we'll read it and literally believe it says another. I came that they would have stuff and have it abundantly. And so we pray it that way. We believe it that way. But that's not what he said. He said, I came that they would have life and have it abundantly. And then this week, he's telling them what life is really all about. And it's contextualized message and method in resurrection, in eternity with God. Remember, one of Jesus' structural motifs in the Gospel of John, anyway, is message and then demonstration. So we'll have a point and we'll have a story. Over and over, we've seen that. Here, we've got, I am the resurrection and the life, and then we got Jesus healing and raising Lazarus from the dead. It's kind of like chalkboard, stoichiometry, and then you get a bathroom break, and then you put on the lab coat, you fire up the Bunsen burners, and you break out the test tubes, and you actually get to do it. That's how Jesus works, at least in the Gospel of John. And so one more time, he's telling them here what life, that commodity which he came that they would have abundantly, what life is really all about. John chapter 11 continues in verse 32, when Mary arrived and saw Jesus, even Mary. Mary's the one who's always fallen at Jesus' feet. She's the one that normally gets it. But Mary echoes Martha's words verbatim. She fell at his feet again, but she said, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. So Martha says it more snarky and Martha-like. Mary says it all at his feety, but she's still saying it. And what you can tell by virtue of the fact that they say the exact same thing is this had become like a refrain in their home for the last 3 days. They had been saying this. This thing had been said. If only Jesus had been here, Lazarus wouldn't have died. And Martha seems to have won out in Mary's consciousness, and she forgets her having grasped the bigger part. And she reiterates, when Jesus saw her weeping, even Mary, even the one who really gets me, he saw her weeping too and saw the other people wailing with her. A deep anger welled up within him. And he was deeply troubled. So he's troubled, but he gets angry. And that is a curveball. Jesus doesn't get angry all that often that we see. John, admittedly, the granular gospel, the analog gospel like we talked about last year in introducing it, John gives us more of the tapestry of Jesus' feelings. So we get more emotional Jesus. And I think it's because John's a little emo himself. He's like the teenager. And he's kind of like the emo gospel. But I'm resisting 1,000 cultural rabbit trails right now. I'm in the act of resisting. See, I did it. John gives us Jesus emotional and unplugged and behind the scenes. And Jesus got angry. And that's weird to me. Like, you're in a room full of bereaved, grieving friends. What? You're God. So clearly, Jesus, we got to rule out some options as to what's going on here. He's not insensitive because he's God. He's full of compassion. He's slow to anger. He's abounding in steadfast love. He's not out of touch because he's been living in his ivory palace, because he was tried in every way as we are, as a man of sorrows himself. He understands more than the next dude the need for solace and compassion. So what gives? Have you ever thought about this? Have you ever read this and gone, huh? He got angry. Like they just lost their brother. You're like, have a heart, man. He was your friend too. So why on earth is he angry? Well, perhaps he had just finished saying, I am the resurrection and the life. This is what life is really all about. And no sooner had the words gotten out of his mouth than they, all wailing and disconsolate and totally undone, seemed to have disregarded it. It's like the transcendent purpose of Jesus went in one ear and out the other. It indicates that they believed it, but they weren't living it. It's kind of similar to Jesus telling his disciples at one point, okay guys, I'm going to let you in on what's really going on. I'm actually going to die. We're on our way to Jerusalem, but we're not going to do what you think we're going to do. We're not going there to overthrow Rome. I'm not putting on the beret and grabbing the Kalashnikov and storming the palace. This is a different sort of kingdom. And here's how it begins. I have to be brutally beaten, sold out by my friend, and killed. And they're like, interesting. And then immediately after, Scripture says, they get into an argument about which of them is the greatest. And Jesus is like, you freaking people. He gets mad. I think this is the same set of emotions here. He just finished telling them, I am the resurrection, Martha. In your kitchen is the resurrection and what life is really about. And she's like, yeah. Ah! And so I think that got him upset. Where have you put him? Jesus asked, and they told him, Lord, come and see. And then at that point, Jesus wept. We know that he has anger and he has deep distress. He's moved emotionally. Both are happening in him, but now, like God, his compassion wins out. And the people who were standing nearby said, see how much he loved him. But some said, this man healed a blind man. Couldn't he have kept Lazarus from dying? So this is like the one ring out grieving friends. These are the people that aren't like ugly crying, like, this is like the group right outside of that. And they're like, geez, what kind of friend is that? And so you see the conversation that's going on. They're like, loved him? He's not weeping because he loved him. If he loved him, he wouldn't have taken his time getting here. We know what this guy can do. Well, Jesus knows this is the conversation going on in the just outside the ugly crying ring around Lazarus. He was still angry, therefore, when he arrived at the tomb, because he's like giving the old Italian mama thing, that kind of thing. I don't even know what that means, but it kind of says, what is wrong with you? So he's still angry, and he arrives at the tomb, a cave with a stone rolled across its entrance, and then he says, roll the stone aside. And we all know what happened. Lazarus, come forth. His greatest miracle. So if he's angry, why does he weep? Well, not so hard to understand. This sadness and this darkness that Jesus is immersed in of this present world, the ravages, the throes of sin and death overcome him. And it's the duality of these emotions that seem to characterize Jesus in his response to the world. Remember, he's angry that Jerusalem won't accept the gospel. He comes in cracking a whip and driving out the people from the temple who are missing the forest for the trees. But then, a chapter later, he arrives and weeps over the city. This duality of emotion is pretty consistent with what we've seen of Jesus' character. Well, that's what's going on here. I think that's the big deal in this passage. Aside from the transcendent statement, I am the resurrection and the life, what's going on here of note is Jesus being an emotional guy and this strange paradox of emotion. Anger itself seemingly out of place in this scene, and then weeping and disturbed at the same time. So that's what's going on. What does it all mean? Well, I would suggest that from this passage we could take this idea. The more we're hung up on this life, the less we truly live. I think Jesus is pointing out that the more we're hung up on this life, the less we truly live. What he's getting at is what life is really all about. He's getting at our disproportionate concern with the material world, material objects and stuff, but material flesh and blood as well. Ironic, isn't it? To those living in abject poverty, abundant life snaps to an eternal qualitative grid. When to those of us living in unprecedented material abundance, abundant life means more material abundance. Isn't it ironic? This is why Jesus said it is very hard indeed for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. It's not that he has a bias against us who have won the global lottery, that he doesn't like our late model cars. I don't think he cares. He's happy for us to have dependable transportation and to get around in style to boot. I think it's what the stuff does. It's not even how it corrupts our character primarily, but how it narrows our focus, how it shortens our sight. That's what makes it so hard. Yet, theologies have wrongly been concocted through the centuries to say that the gospel is about poverty, and if you're rich, you're out of God's sight or care, which couldn't be further from the truth, because Jesus, when the rich young man approached him, looked at him and loved him. When the man pressed further on what do I need to do to live the real thing, Jesus said, all right, you want the answer? Here it is. You got to sell your stuff, man. It wasn't because poverty is the key. It's because what is the key, you can't grasp. Because both of your hands are holding on to your stuff with the kung fu grip. So you got to get rid of the stuff. That's when the guy went away sad. 2 Corinthians 4, Paul gives us a little illumination, as he so reliably does. He said this irony. This is why we never give up. He said, though we ourselves, our bodies are dying, our spirits are being renewed every day. For our present troubles are small and won't last very long, yet they produce for us a glory that vastly outweighs them and that will live forever. What life is really all about. So we don't look at the troubles we can see now. Rather, we fix our gaze on things that cannot be seen. For the things we see now will soon be gone. But the things we cannot see will last forever. And so he lives on the fulcrum between these two worldviews. And he says, we continue to choose the long game. In the face of pressing circumstances in the near focus, we continue to refresh our perspective on what life really is. I think we who have won the global lottery, we make out death to be the worst thing. That's one. Poverty to be second, and unhappiness to be third. As a wedge of global society, I think those are probably our priority order subconscious values. Death's the worst. Heaven forbid this thing come to an end. Poor is second. Unhappy is third. And I think maybe Jesus sees it different. Going to a place like Ethiopia makes you come home and want to remember how fortunate we are. And that's a good takeaway. I don't mean to be snarky myself. I had that effect. It happens whenever you travel to the developing world that there's a 3 or 4 day window of gridlock and righteous indignation over the fact that we have an entire aisle in the grocery store devoted to snack cakes while they're cooking and using the restroom in the same spot. That's normal. I feel it. Those of you who have just come home from the missions teams, you feel it. But I don't know if that's the end of it. I don't know if we've got the whole or even the right of it when our takeaway is how fortunate we are. One, it makes the majority of the global less fortunate sort of training aids for our growing self-awareness. Thank God they put on that little play of poverty to remind me how my problems aren't really problems. I can't sell a house from the recession, and they're struggling with water that doesn't poison them. It does have that effect. But here's where I tripped up. Let me show you one picture. I won't do the pastor slideshow from my travels. I'm just going to show you one. I spent the day with these kids. This was a spontaneous picture. I was sitting in the front row of a church I was about to talk to them in, and they were right behind me, and I turned around and I was like, okay, everyone pile in for a picture. And this happened. Once in a lifetime, you get like that perfect picture that when you're not a photographer at all. I just got lucky. So these kids were attached to my hand all day. And I don't mean to make light of global poverty. They live in meager circumstances, to be sure. I went to their homes. It's awful. Yet, they weren't told to pose. I didn't say, hey, would you just look happy for my friends? The truth is, there is probably, undoubtedly, let me not go there. Let me just say this. This guy, he's not going to struggle with happiness because every little girl he looks at is going to look back at him like that and bat her eyelashes. He's going to have other challenges. That guy is going to win whatever he competes in. I mean, if you play him in Parcheesi, he will beat you. Give him a year or two. This guy, if he gets the opportunity, may be the prime minister of Ethiopia. The point is, they don't have anything. And yet, it's difficult for me to reconcile a paradigm that overtly says, remember how fortunate I am, and tacitly reciprocates with how unfortunate they are. I don't know that they see it that way. Because we see them and we're like, good heavens, poor children. Somebody needs to put 3 $600 plus portable electronic devices in their hands immediately. Or what kind of future are they going to have? Like, how on earth are they going to access the internet? How will they download mindless games that they can play with their thumbs all day? Like our kids. It's my kids too. We think, oh man, we got to give him the good life. I confess, when this kid held onto my hand all day, I thought, how could I adopt him and give him a better life? And then as I was flying home, I'm like, would it be better? Yes, water that isn't apt to poison you would be better than the reverse. But what about carrying around mental poison in your pocket all day at school when mom and dad can't know who's grabbing it and making you look at it? Which poison is worse? Do we have it better? Honestly? I found myself thinking, God forbid I drag them into this culture. Helping them find Jesus and change their own culture. That for Jesus, that may be the greatest help. Who's the less fortunate? Who is helping whom? For me, I can tell you that arrow is going this way. So what are we to do about this? This great inversion that is Jesus' paradigm of the kingdom. Well, we're going to, I think, undertake a partnership that will give us practical opportunities to do a lot of great and neat things together. All of us doing something. That's going to take some time because we're going to do our due diligence and make sure that we're, one, investing your worship resources in trustworthy, responsible ways, and two, because we're not going to ask you to give of your time and your heart before we're confident that it's going to be best stewarded. But I think we're onto something, and I think you're going to be excited about it, and I can't wait to tell you and kick it off in the weeks and months to come. But in the meantime, what do we do about it personally? One, I think this passage asks us to rethink our prosperity bias. Do you know what I mean? Our bias that says more wealth, stuff, material abundance is necessarily better. We tend to quantify abundant life when Jesus qualifies it. And I think they qualify it too. I think we may zoom out all the way when we get to heaven and realize, oh, we who thought we were the ones who had got it and were explaining it, we're the ones that didn't get it. The joke was on us. Rethink our prosperity bias. I'll give you some reading on your own this week. James chapter 1 in verses 9 through 11. We don't have time to go into it now. Jesus said, blessed are the poor. And I don't think that was a consolation prize. I think theirs is the kingdom of heaven, not because ours is not, but because it's more accessible to them. What do we do about it? Well, I think this passage asks us. Jesus' quizzical emotional response to his own friend's death asks us to face our trials. Don't tune out and go to La La Land, but face them in the face of eternity, recognizing this is not the end. This is hardly the beginning. Listen, James 1:12, God blesses those who patiently endure testing and temptation, trial, other translations say, because after that trial, they'll receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. Do you realize what that's saying? The crown of life, the green flag, the go, doesn't even happen until this body stops breathing. We're getting up to the start line. Face our trials, but face them in the face of eternity. And lastly, what do we do about this? I think we worry a lot less. The things we worry about, the things I worry about, I don't think they matter as much as I think they do. Jesus said, is not life more than food and the body more than clothing? Matthew 6:25. Worry a lot less when we rediscover what life is really all about. It's a story of an old African pastor. His church and the orphanage it sponsored was staffed by other old, frail people. When one day the gang of thugs that ride around in pickup trucks and kidnap children showed up. It's a true story. And as a show of their power, they had the old frail pastor and the staff of the orphanage kneel. And the pastor alone stood in front of them. And they said, didn't you hear me? I have the power to kill you. Kneel, pointing a gun in his face. And he said, I will kneel to no one but God. And let me correct you, sir. You do not have the power to kill me, for I have already died. Could any of us say that? Yes, we've died with Christ. Yes, we're going to heaven. But does any of us understand, hear what life is really about? Would you stand with me? Father, thanks for your word. Thanks for caring enough about us who didn't ask for it or deserve it, but won the global lottery and find ourselves in that odd minority camp of the ones that you said have a harder time of it. Us, the globally and historically wealthy.